Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today this is going to be a sequel of my last video. In case you have not looked at my last video, I will really suggest that you click on either this link, videos link, and look at this last one right here, or alternatively you can always go to the playlist and click on this first playlist, full stack web development, and of course in the list that you see you can just look at the second video right here, and feel free to look at the other one as well. So basically the intention of this entire series is to create a client server set of tutorial where using those client server sets we're going to create a secure web-based application that will manage basically various users, right? In my last video, I explained how to create that web application using a Node.js, Express.js, using JWT and Angular. And of course, in the last video, I only explained the code that was done on the server side using Node.js, Express.js, and using the JWT token library. Today, what we're going to do, we are going to extend the tutorial to also explain how the codes are laid out on the client side and the Angular, how Angular is using those API that we created last time in the last video that I explained, and how they're properly used and how the application itself is functioning. Now, I will do my best to start this tutorial so that you don't necessarily have to watch the first video. But again, it will really help if you do, because you kind of get a context on where I'm coming from. Again, if you watch the last video, that's probably enough, but feel free to watch my other videos on these playlists. That will definitely be helpful. And of course, whenever you get some other time, do watch my other videos that I have loads of various tutorials that I talk about Spring Boot, MySQL, course, Angular, React, Python, and other technologies that is useful. Okay, I'm just going to go through some basics first, even though they have been mentioned in this video. But again, I'll just try my best to be seamless. All right, the very first thing you're going to need is, of course, Node.js. Download that, install that. Then, of course, you're going to need Visual Studio Code, some IDE to maintain and develop the code. I use Visual Studio Code. You don't have to, but it's probably easier for you to download and install that if you want to follow this video. Then the next thing you're going to need is make sure you have an account on MongoDB. So this is basically the links, and all of these links are actually mentioned in the description below of the YouTube videos, and also it is specified in the GitHub link that I also mentioned that in that description below. And it'll also be there, of course, of the description of this YouTube video. So again, you're gonna need an account on the MongoDB. It's free. I have already logged into the account. So in the previous video, I have shown how to create like a database and also a specific basic collection. And that's exactly what you're gonna need as well. So make sure you have all that set up before going through the next set of tutorials that I'm going to talk about today. And of course, there is a brief flow chart that I have also mentioned in the previous video. So this is basically what this is, as I just mentioned. Download Node.js, download Visual Studio Code, register MongoDB, create your users collection. Let me show you how that looks. So basically, last time I created a database/schema called ICS Discover. And inside that, I have also created a collection/tables. So basically in RDBMS world, this would be a database, or schema, this would be a table. It's a similar concept, but this is a NoSQL database, MongoDB. So that's basically what you would need. Once you have that, that's it. The next step would be is to get the code from GitHub, which I have also mentioned in the description below. So this is basically the code that you would be getting from here. So check out that code and then locate your two separate directories, right? So once you check out the code, you will have like a client set and you'll have a server, right? That's exactly how it will look like. So this is where I checked out the code called user management, and there's a client and there's a server. And last time I basically specified and in details how the server code is laid out. Today I'm going to describe how the client code that's written in Angular that's laid out. So server, again, just a refresh, it was done in Express.js using the MongoDB database at the back end, and also it used the JWT token to secure each and every API request. Now, the client is basically done in Angular, and we're going to go ahead and talk about that today. So I have used Visual Studio Code, as I mentioned, but again, you can use any IDE you like, but in order to follow, use Visual Studio Code, that will be easier. So as you could see, I have literally opened that directory, right? So let me show you. I literally went to that directory and just typed code dot in that directory. That basically will bring up Visual Studio Code in that directory, and I have a client and server subdirectory, as you saw before on my Windows Explorer, and this is the code that I talked about last time. Now, another thing I also mentioned that, of course, inside the Visual Studio Code, you can have multiple terminals, and that's what I got. So as you could see, I already have the server up and running, listening to 8080 port, and this is the client, so I can have multiple, right, command prompt that I could run. So this one is running on port 4200, and this is that Angular client code. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, so I'll just quickly go over it. So when we used the server-side code, there's two environment variable that we had to set up. The two environment variable was, one of them was called user management Mongo URI. This basically describes what your database URL looks like, which you would get it from MongoDB, which I mentioned in the previous YouTube video. So go ahead, take a look at that. And then the other thing that you would be needing is basically the name of the schema. And the name of the schema is mentioned using user management MongoDB. So this is the piece that I forgot to mention. I specified that you need to set it up, but I never showed you how the code is being used. So here it's using, whenever it's basically getting a reference to the database object, it is referencing basically from the environment variable the database name / the schema name. Okay, so that's it. Now let's get to the code. First of all, you expand the client, and client, there is only one subfolder called Angular. In the future, if you look at my very first video on this series of tutorial, I mentioned that in the future we can actually add more different clients and more different types of server, like Spring Boot created server logging into a MySQL database, or Spring Boot connected to a MongoDB, right? Or React, listening to the React server and also logging into the different database. So in Angular, the first thing that we're going to do is take a look at how this thing is laid out, right? As you can see, this is a normal standard Angular project. I don't have anything fancy in there other than the different packages that I have used, right? And of course, the packages that I've used, you can kind of take a look at it. In the package.json, as you could see, I have used the CDK that is from Angular, standard development kit. And I have also used the Angular material for the web forms and the different look and feel for the buttons and stuff like that. And I have used Bootstrap, to style my various web pages, right? I have also used Bootstrap icon, and there's also another thing that I have used called Font Awesome. Font Awesome is a very easy and economical way to actually use extremely professional looking icons. So these are kind of the various packages, if you will, that I have used, and that's all about it. So the very first thing that happens, so first actually let me show you the run. Once you run it, the Angular, which is, as I showed you, it listens to the localhost 4200, you get a login page, right? So where is this thing going? So let's go talk about it. The first thing that happens is, of course, it's going to go to always, as you know, it's going to go to the index, and eventually index knows exactly where the things are, launched. And as you could see that this is, of course, this is standard Angular main TypeScript, and it will eventually load the app module, right? And here, this is just a specific code that I added for Bootstrap, and that's fine. So it's going to load the app module, and as you know, the app module is basically the first module, which is right here, right? So this is the module that it's going to load. And here it actually loads the rest of the other services and modules. A couple of things that I have, as you know, that I am using a API, right? So in the back end, the client will be interacting with the server by some API calls to fetch the data, right? But here on the login page, in the first thing that will hit is loading all the modules, all the modules that are loaded. Then what's going to happen is this is basically the basic router. And if you look at this code literally refers to all the basic navigations of the template at the top. So let's go back just to show you. So it's basically these codes right here, all of these links, this button right here, and then basically saying that this is going to be the template. And from there, then the first thing is, of course, it's going to go to the default router, right? The default router, if you kind of go to the standard, the router file, which is going to be the app routing model.ts. So here you could see that I get several routers defined in here, right? And the empty router is the login component, as you can see. So the very first thing that's going to do is going to go to the login component. There are others, as you can see there. This one is also called the login component. So if you type login, that will also go there as well. There's the add user, list user, edit user, right? As simple as that. Now, there's also a dialog component where I show various dialogues, the yes, no dialogues, and okay dialogues. That I will also mention it. But basically, if you look at this app module code, it is going straight to the default routing, which is the login component. And all the components are defined in a standard way that Angular suggests inside the, basically in its own subdirectory. So as you could see, for each of the components, I have various subdirectories. For login, this is the login, and that's where it's going to go, right? As you can see right here, login component. And that's exactly where this is going to go. And it's going in there, and there is all the necessary codes. And feel free to take a look at each one of them. I'm not going to talk about each and every little details because that would be overwhelming, and this is not an Angular tutorial by any means, but at least I will explain what are some critical code that it is going through to actually show the login page. So the very first thing that I like to do is let's look at something common, right? Let's look at the style sheet. So if I go to the app component CSS, there's nothing in there. But if you go to the main style.css, there's some basic common style element that is in there. As you could see, go to the height of HTML, the body heights, there's some font family, margin. The background image that you see right there, it's coming from there actually, right? That's where it's defined. Then the rest of the other stuff. And then you will see that there's some basic things that is defined, the basic containers, the version infos, the user containers. The user containers are typically used in the user forms that you will see. That and this is also being used in the login. So that's why I wanted to specify this so that you know that exactly where this is coming from. Now, let's look at the login component CSS. It's empty because it's getting all of its styles from that main CSS. If there's anything that's needed specific to login, I would have put in here. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is the HTML page. An HTML page, as you could see, it's a standard HTML, right? And you got a login, username, and a password. And of course, this is basically tying up with a form, absolutely, as you can see. And there's some, logout messages that is being shown as well. If there's, something goes wrong or whatever. And this is the thing that you wanted to look at is the form group, where these things are coming from. And inside the form group, and each of these form element items are actually binded, right? And you also have some built-in validation that is specified. If you don't, specify any login or password, it will literally say that, hey, go ahead, you need to enter a password and enter a login. So that's also in here using the Angular syntax. So that's what this is, and that's what makes the page to show up with the login prompt and the username and password controls. So now this is the standard. I haven't done much in here. The next thing is to look at is the actual code, because what happens is, if you go back to HTML, when you click on the login button, what happens is it will submit the form, and as you look at it right here, the way it submits it, it calls this onSubmit function. So now let's go back and look at the TypeScript, and we're going to put our focus on the onSubmit. And onSubmit, what happens is first it does validate the form, and if the form is not valid, it will definitely return. But if it's valid, the next thing it does is, of course, gets a username and password. Then let's pay attention to this. It calls an API service called login, right? What that is. So let's talk about that. This API service login, where is this coming from? If you go look at that, this API service is coming from right here. This API service is nothing but this reference right here. And if you follow that reference is basically that variable and that type right here. And that's where this thing is initialized in the constructor. So let's look at this guy right here. If I go to service api.service, so there is another directory where the API calls are all made, right? api.service TypeScript. So right here, this is where all of the various API calls are defined, right? As you could see right here, this is where it's calling the login, get users by ID, create users, update users, delete users, and log out, right? As simple as that. So pretty straightforward. And of course, these are just some standard the prefix, which you can change once you deploy to like a production environment, change it to whatever you want. And if you look at the server side, which I talked about last time, there are typically two main URI prefixes. One goes by AUTH, which is the login and logout. The other one is users, where you could do the actual operations after you're on the secure zone. So that's what these are. Okay, so now let's get back to our login that we're talking about on submit. So on submit, of course, it makes that API call, the login, and submits on the login and password. And this is where it calls the API, right? And once the data is 200, if you remember, the server returns a status, and that it has to be 200, then it gets the result. And in the result, if we go back and look at the server, let me just quickly show you so that it makes sense. So all of the send that happens from the API, it literally sends these three things: status, message, and result. And feel free to take a look at the details. Like, for example, when a login is done, it calls this guy right here, and the login returns status if it's successful 200, message is success, and the result is what? It returns a JWT token as token, then returns username, returns first name, returns last name, and returns authorities, like what are the different authorities that this user has, right? So let's get back here. So results basically have the results that comes out of that API call when it's 200, right? So from here, what it's doing is it's defining this user class, right? So what is this user class? Where this thing came from? Let's look at the source, right? So it is actually defined in, this is the model. As you could see, model has all of these three TypeScript files. One of them is user model, and this user model is defined. So it literally has, if you look at this thing, it looks exactly similar to how the database is defined. So if you go look at this, as you see, the database has ID, first name, last name, username, password, salary, age, authorities. That's exactly what this thing has, right? So similar thing. And by default, of course, it's a user type, and it's got some default values. So that's what this is. So it is basically taking all of the values from the result, first name, last name, username, authorities, and of course, as you can see, one other thing that's happening, this is where the security comes in, right? If it's a valid user, you will have a JWT token, and it is defining the token out of the result and setting it into the local storage. The local storage is secure. It's not that everyone can access. It's kind of like, think about like cookies. So that's where it sets it for this specific application. As you know, HTTP is a stateless protocol. So this is how it will basically keep track of the user, if it's the same user, and if this user is valid, to actually call the API with this specific token, and this token even is valid. right? So that's what's happening. So it's one thing that it's setting up the token, the other thing is setting up the current user. Now, of course, if you look at the identifier, that is defining this constants token. And if you look at the user's definition, it's also defined in the model constants. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of static variable defined in this thing, in the constants. So role user, role admin, current user token, ID. So these are the things, that's how it's going to be defined. Those are the identifiers. Okay, so it sets all this thing nicely and it understands that this is all good to go. And then what it does, it routes the user to another screen, right? Remember, we're using a router. And where is the router? It's right here. So the router of list-user is going to be this guy. That is the list user component. So if you go trail back, that is this guy right here, user, list user component, right? So if I go to this guy, user, list user, it's going to this list user component. So it's going to go in here. So that's the next thing that we're going to talk about. All right. So basically what we said is on the login from this on submit call, eventually it navigates to the list user. If there's an error, of course, it says invalid login is true, and whatever message that has been thrown from the API, that's the message is going to be shown in the message section, right? And what is the message section? The message section is literally shown up right here, right? If there's a problem, it's going to show at the bottom right there. So that's kind of it. And let's now go look at click on this button right here. What happens is, of course, it's calling the API, and I know I have the valid login, so it ends up into this screen. And this screen happens to be, we saw that this is the list user screen, and that's exactly what we saw in the code. So let's go back to the code. So in the code, we're interested in the user subdirectory and then the list user. And let's start with the HTML page. And well, we can start with CSS. As you can see, there's some specific CSS in there, right? So we are using, some specific tabular style sheet, and also some user container, table container, and form field, how it's supposed to look like. So other than that, that's it. And then let's look at the HTML now. The HTML, as you could see, that this is relying on making sure that, hey, if the user is certain type, then it's going to do certain things. So that is also in there, as you could see. First of all, it is checking that, look, what the user information, if there's a current user, this valid user, it's getting some information out of that, right? Welcome current user. That's basically, I'll show you in the code how that is being set. It's basically being set with their user specific information. And then, of course, it is relying on certain other things. For example, you see there's a user Boolean check that basically checking if this user is an admin user versus a normal user, right? That's how it shows the add user button, and that's also how it shows or hides certain fields. For example, certain fields like username, certain fields like salary, certain fields or certain buttons like edit button or delete button. Those are not shown if you are a normal user, right? So that is exactly what this is checking. It's checking if you're a normal user, you are basically not going to get the username. It's going to be hidden. That's what this thing is, right? So these are all done in the HTML, which you kind of see seamlessly and happens. And of course, I told you about the font awesome icons. So all the icons that you see, you will see something like this. Icon equals to FA pen. This stands for font awesome pen icon, right? And I'll also show you how those are referenced. So that's kind of it right here. And of course, it's got some actions items, right? For example, it does, when you click on add user, it calls this function on click add user. So we're going to look at that one. When you click on, for example, edit user, if you're an admin and all those admin functions, it calls something called edit user. If you call it delete, now instead of calling it delete straight, it does an open dialog, right? Because what happens is it actually confirms the user, hey, do you really want to delete or not? Just to be 100% sure. So that's why it's calling this open dialog. We'll talk about that as well. So let's get into the code. So if you refer to the TypeScript code right here, there's lots of stuff that it uses. The very first thing I'm going to show you is that font awesome thing, right? How this is being used. So as you could see that there's some imports about all of different icons. So this is the plus icon, pen icon, trash icon, door open icon, and all of these are used on that page. And let's see where. So this is that pen icon, trash icon, plus icon, and then outdoor icon. So these are all of the one that's being used, right? And this is, we're getting it from Font Awesome. So that's what the Font Awesome is used, right? And this is where you use it by declaring like this. Okay, the next thing is, of course, it's using some display column, standard stuff, what are the columns that's going to be shown. But mostly we're interested in how it is getting, for example, let's start with the beginning, how it is getting this guy, the current user, right? What is this? So if you go back to the list user component, the TypeScript, the very first thing that you will see that it does in the ng on init, in the initialization, it checks, hey, do I have a token? So this is where it checks that, look, is that a valid user? If it has a token, then this is good. The next thing it does is it's also going to get it. Another thing it said was the current user variable, right? So it also gets that from the local storage, parses it, and then there's a variable defined right here called current user. Then what it does, it sets that variable, the current user, to first name space last name space the username with a bracket. And that's exactly what you see right here. Welcome Muhammad Islam, and then Islam in the parentheses. So that's kind of it right there. And then of course it checks another thing, and it basically sets another variable. As you can see, another variable is user, right? Is that a normal user or not? By default it's false. So it also gets the authorities, and based on the authorities it checks, well, look, is that a normal user? If it is, then current authorities is normal user. Otherwise, of course, it's going to be an admin. So that's kind of it. And as you could see, if it's not a valid user, right, that means the token is not valid, it's going to kick them out back to login. So this user will never be able to log in, right? So that's kind of how it works. Then, of course, the other thing that happens is once everything is successful, that means it didn't return back, everything was good here, then it goes and does what? It makes a call to the service API layer, right? It calls to get users. If you remember, if I go to the definition of this, there is an API call for get users, and this is what it's calling, right? So that's exactly how it gets its list of users, and it sets it in the data. Okay, so that's kind of it. And this data is exactly a data.result, and this is where the result, if you remember, result is where the API sets its list of data. So if I go back to the server again, just to show you, users.js, let's go look at the get users. So this is the get users right here. And then look what happens. In the send, what is sending? 200. This is the message. And the result is what? Result is literally the result of that entire list, right? And that's exactly what's being returned right here, data.result. And that is being set as the data. And this is the data. We go back to the HTML. That is the data that is solely being used to completely show the list of users, right? So if you look right here, this table or container, for each of these data, it actually goes and sets the IDs and first name and last name, and of course the age, and of course the salary. So kind of that's if you look at the ng container and the mat table, this is exactly how it works. It basically sets the data source, right? And if you go back to the GS, it sets the data sources data as this entire list, and that's how it knows exactly what to show. All right, the other thing to check is, of course, if you remember, there was a function called add user and edit user, right? Now, what happens to the add user? Whenever you call add user, it just routes it to add user, right? Which is another components right there. That would be right here, add user. And then if there's an edit user, what it does, it basically removes the current ID, because that is what's being set in the local storage to say what's the current ID. Then it sets what is the current user's ID that has been selected, and then it just navigates to the edit user. And edit user will use this information to fetch only that user, right? So that's exactly how it happens. And then of course delete user is called internally. How? Because if you remember, when delete user is called right here, just to refresh your memory, it actually calls open dialog. So it actually calls this open dialog right here, and open dialog does is basically opens a dialog. And if you trace this back, this open dialog is using a mat dialog component, right? And what is that mat dialog component doing? It is using this component right here, and this component is defined. If we kind of go back, look up, this dialog component is one of our component that we created right here. Where it is, it's in dialog box component, right? So there is a folder called dialog box, right? And if you go look at that folder right here, then you will go to the dialog box TS file, and this is the dialog box component. So inside that component, of course, it uses all kinds of icons, and as I mentioned, how it's retrieved, and then it uses mat dialog component, and of course it gets some specific user related data, and it basically says that, hey, am I going to what type of action I'm going to use? Am I going to use the close action, or am I going to use the cancel action? If I'm going to use the close action, what happens, right? So these are the things that it's basically doing, right? And if you go back to this dialog right here, the list user rather, so it calls that dialog and it gets a response, right? And basically it says if the response is, and it listens to some event saying, if it says that you got to go delete that, then go ahead, calls this function delete user, and that's what this is. And then all it does is calls the API to delete the user, and it deletes it. Okay, as simple as that. And then once it deletes the user, see, another thing that happens in here, which I have not talked about, is there's also an apply filter function. What the apply filter function does, if you go look at the dialog components HTML, there's a lot of stuff that is happening, that this thing also has a nice filter. Like if I start typing, let's say Islam, it will automatically filter it. Well, how is it happening? It's also using a nice search filter that is part of the Angular map table. Look at the corresponding HTML, and let's look at that specific filter thing that actually drives that filter search. So what happens is right here, so this is part of the mat form field. As you can see, there is a method that it's calling, a function rather, call and key up, apply filter, and it's passing the event. So that's exactly what's being called. So if you go back to the code, all this apply filter is doing, it's basically saying that, hey, if it's an element, get that filter value, and all you got to do is go to the data source, and that's where this thing is useful. It's got a filter, and it just basically says it's filter lowercase, and it will automatically filter out that table. And that's the beauty of using that mat table, right? And same thing is happening if you delete something, right? If it's basically deleting a data, the next thing that it's doing is, after, if delete is successful, if the delete service call is successful, you see that it is filtering out the data, and it's basically saying that, hey, go ahead, filter out the data again, because this thing has been updated. So that's all this thing is doing. All right. So once we are done with this, as you can see that from this interface, we can also add a user and then edit a user, right? So let's go and look at that. So there's this add user and the edit user. Both of them are kind of the same, so I'm just not going to go through each one of them. I will probably go back and forth, but you will get the idea. If you look at one of the HTMLs, it will look exactly similar, because if you happen to go back and click on edit, it kind of looks same, and I can go back, and if I hit add, it will look the same, right? The only difference is in add, you get to add username, password, and all that business. In edit, you cannot change the username, right? Because that's kind of the primary key. But you can change the password and the other stuff. So it is similar looking HTML. So the HTML would be similar, right? The only difference would be the how it does validation and the submission of the form, right? And of course, as I mentioned, that each of these form has its built-in validation in there. So that's what these things, anytime you see something like this, it's got an add form control, and it also checks, for minimal length, for example, in case of username, and if it's a record or not. And again, look at I'm an add user. So same thing for each of the forms, just take a look at it. It has its own validation, and also it's tied to a field. Now, once you click on a button, right, of course, it calls the standard submission, right? And what the submission does, the submission basically says that, hey, I'm going to call the onSubmit button, and this is a Angular form. So let's go look at the code. In the code, when you're adding it, you're actually not initializing anything, right? Anything in the sense that you're not getting any data. It's just a blank form. So that's what this is. So this is how it's initialized in the add form object right here. And of course, this is a standard code you will see on every page. It checks if the user is valid. It's got to take the token, right? If the token is valid. If not valid, it will kick them back to the login page. So that's what this is. And otherwise, of course, it just goes and checks some other stuff, gets the current user and makes sure the current users are good. And again, the other thing that it's got to do is it needs to make sure that it's got the current authority. See, this is another thing it's checking, an extra mile, if you will, that look, if this user happens to be a normal user, they don't have access to add, so they should not be able to continue. So if someone, let's say, happens to hack and just get to this page, at least if even though they're not admin, this will prevent them, they will kick them out. So this is a security check. So we're interested in onSubmit, right? And onSubmit is nothing but once they submitted something, so we're getting the list of authorities. I'm going to come back to that, because authorities, if you look at that, that's a radio button. So we're going to have to kind of handle it a little bit special way to get the value. So it checks if the form is invalid, and then based on that, if we got that nice user model, it's going to initialize that, and then it's going to make a service call of create user, because it already gotten onSubmit. It has all the form values, right? All the list of values. So it is basically passing those values based on this user object. So that's what this thing is doing. And then if it's successful, it's just showing you a message using that open dialog that we kind of saw already. That's a common function that common component that we added here, if you will, right? The dialog component. So it just shows that dialog with an OK button this time, not a yes, no button. So that's all this is. Any error, it just shows an open dialog also with that error. Now let's look back. What is this thing doing with that authorities business? Well, what happens is the way you handle a radio button, if you change a radio button, you need to kind of capture what happened. So if a radio button state has been changed, if it's an user or an administrator, it needs to save that value in this authorities, this variable. That's exactly what's happening. So it is saving in this variable, and then later on, the form value is being set from this variable. I know it's a little bit clumsy, but that's how it is, so that the authorities are being set in this form. This value is being set to the correct variable, to the correct value rather. So that's all this is. That's what the add is doing. And the open dialog, it is opening a dialog, showing an OK message, and being done with it. And then once it's done, it's just basically saying, hey, after close, just go back to the list user. So that's all this is. Same thing, if you go back to the edit component, it's similar, right? It's checking, all kinds of validation that's happening, or checking rather. And then also there's an input button that actually, not input button, submit button that submits the form with this guy right here, that update button right there. And then this basically calls the onSubmit, and onSubmit is right here in this edit components. And similar thing in the edit, of course, in the edit, initially the form needs to be loaded, and let's see how that's happening. That's happening in the constructor, as you can see. Again, standard code, it first checks if the user session is valid. If it's valid, if you recall, when from the list, when someone was clicking on edit, it was passing an ID, and this is that ID that it's getting from the storage, right? So again, just to refresh your memory, if you go back to the list user, TS, whenever edit user is being called, it is capturing what is the current ID and is setting into this constant storage. And that's how it is retrieving that information, right? This is the user ID, and then if it's not valid, if it's invalid, it's gonna kick you back out to the list of users. It doesn't know what to do with it. But if it's valid, then it's doing what? It is basically calling get user by ID, and it is using that user ID, right? So that's what this is using. And then if you look at this guy right here, that is nothing but the API call in the server. Let's go there. And that would be right there. That's this call right here, right? How do I know that? Is if you go trace this back, we go back and edit. If you trace this API service, this method, you will see that this is calling that get API, right? Passing that user ID and that ID as that. This is called the URL path variable, rather, right? So that's exactly how I know. Okay, so anyway, so it's making that call and then getting the results, and then of course it's getting all the relevant information, basically getting the list of authorities. And this is another magic that's happening here, right? So authorities is a variable that is being keep track so that we can set the state of the radio button properly, right? So that's what that is basically. So after it gets after it's getting the right here. Yeah, after it gets the user ID, the information, then it sets the authority, then it sets that if that a user or an admin, so it sets this role, because based on that, it will do certain things. That's why it requires that. And of course, it sets all the values of the form, right, with the data result, because if you remember, result is where it sends everything. All right, and then if it's not a valid user, then it goes to the else. Now, so this is the initial phase, right, when the form is being loaded with all the information, because as you can see, if we click on edit on user, it's got to load all of this information. So that's how this is happening. Then of course on change is the same thing. It's keeping track of the radio button that we saw on the ad as well. So keeping track of the value, what has been changed to, sets that authorities as is. And then on submit, of course, it sets that authorities variable that was set on that change event. And then same thing happening. If it's invalid, return. Otherwise, get initialize that user object based on this edit form, and call the update user API service that updates the user, and everything goes well, updates successfully, and then shows a dialog. And that's kind of how it works, right? So very simple as that. Now let's quickly go through what we just talked about and show it on a real action. So starting from the beginning, once you log in with the valid username and password, of course, if your password is invalid, it's going to show you that error, right? But if it's a valid password, then it will log you in. And of course, and then you could do an add a new user. And let's say I'm going to call that 4, and I'm going to have the same password. This is a user. And let's say I'm just going to say test. As you can see, as I enter, if I don't enter anything, it will give me that validation thing. And then I'll add some salary, and I'm going to go ahead and click edit, or I can just hit enter. Either way, it's going to work. And it tells me that this is the message that comes up with the dialog box. It's okay, good, is that been added? And let's check if it was added or not. There it is, and Islam 4 user ID, right? And I'm an administrator, that's why I can see it. So let's see if I can log in using this user, right? So I'm going to go ahead and log out and say okay, and that was the user actually. And I'm going to log in, and voila, I can log in. But look, I'm a user status, right? So I cannot really add anything, I cannot edit anything, I cannot delete anything, and I cannot see the username and salary information. So that's exactly what I intended to do. So I'm going to go ahead and log out and see if I can edit something. So I'm going to log back in as an administrator account. Then I'm going to go ahead and go to that user that I just added and try to edit something. And I'm going to say, let's make this guy an administrator. How about that? And I did make that guy an administrator. And then I'm going to log out and then I'm going to log back in as that user. I keep the same password for simplicity, and now as you can see, I'm an administrator and I am good to go. Okay, so that's kind of it, and that's exactly what I wanted to show you guys. If this video added any benefit to your list of skill set, please do subscribe my YouTube channel and also hit the bell icon so that you can get the subsequent updates and you get notified as well. And please stay tuned because the more good stuffs are coming. Next thing what I'm going to talk about is how we can use Spring Boot as a server-side technology. Thanks again. Bye now.